This video is going to be titled The Timeline, determining how long the attack likely took using actual evidence and science. Y'all know that I have a theory based on all of the evidence around the blood in the crime scene and the DNA results from that evidence. What I've tried to do by learning as much as I could about the actual wound science of these victims is test my theory and see if it holds water. And by doing that, I believe it not only holds water, it proves it to a certain degree. I would love to know your thoughts at the end. But the forensic key to the timelines are the hemorrhagic wound tracks and the minimally hemorrhagic wound tracks. What does that mean? Forensic interpretation. When analyzing multiple sharp force injuries, after much study, I gave it a scenario using, I suggested 40 stab and incise wounds. And of those 40, I suggested that 3 of those wounds were minimally hemorrhagic and had it analyzed. This was the results of that analyzing. When analyzing multiple sharp force injuries, hemorrhagic wounds, 40 in this case, the heart was still pumping effectively. Blood flowed actively into the wound track. These were inflicted while the victim was alive with decent blood pressure. Minimally hemorrhagic, or what they call dry wounds, the 3 wounds, very little to no bleeding occurred. This happens when blood pressure is dropped dramatically or the heart has stopped. There is a big difference in forensic examinations by pathologists when they're examining wounds that are minimally hemorrhagic compared to wounds that are hemorrhagic. But what really comes into play is when they're comparing those wounds in what is perceived as a single attack event, meaning comparing the wounds that are minimally hemorrhagic to an excess of wounds that are all showing signs of being hemorrhagic. That is a telltale sign of clear differences between the timing of the wounds. This is a classic 2-phase injury pattern. Initial attack, the victim received the majority, 40 of the cuts while alive and bleeding normally. Later phase, after a significant period of time, the remaining 3 cuts were made when the victim was either near death, in profound shock, or already deceased. Time estimate, and I have gone through several medical journals just to verify this point right here, and it is clear across the board that forensic pathologists generally interpret this kind of discrepancy as indicating a gap of at least several minutes, at the very least several minutes, often 5 to 15 minutes plus, depending on the severity of blood loss from the first set of wounds. So at least several minutes. That is clear across all of the documentation that I've found regarding this subject. If all the wounds were inflicted at roughly the same time, you would expect similar levels of hemorrhage across the wounds. It's all of the wounds that taken in conjunction with the non-hemorrhagic or minimally hemorrhagic wounds that is the key in this, and it tells the story. A stark difference, like 40 versus 3, is a strong sign of separate episodes of injury. This pattern is frequently described in forensic literature as evidence of overkill or continued assault after the victim was incapacitated. And let's listen to an actual pathologist discuss this in court.
So during your examination and on direct, you noted yellowing around some of the stab wounds?
Yes, sir.
And yellowing around the skin can indicate reduced blood flow at the time of injury.
Well, it's actually in the fat, but yes.
And when blood flow is significantly reduced, it may suggest that the individual had already been incapacitated or deceased.
Well, it tells you that there's not much blood flow in this area. And if there's not much blood flow, then there's not much blood pressure or there's not much blood. And at some point during the loss of blood, yes, you are going to die. And so those wounds won't have bleeding into them, or they'll have very little bleeding into them.
When the yellowing of the skin does not occur if the blood flow is normal, though, that kind of.
Correct. That's, and again, I don't want to be pedantic, but it's the fact that we're talking about.
I don't know if that's.
I know you.
I'm not a doctor, so I'm just trying to keep up with you. Does the presence of yellowing support some of the wounds were inflicted after significant blood loss?
Absolutely, yes, sir.
You said that the cut to the jugular is a large blood flow, but it would be slow because of low pressure.
Right.
If the blood grows, if the blood flow, if the blood flow decreased rapidly, however, that would result in some stab wounds appearing less severe or with less surrounding areas. I said that correctly? That makes sense? Let me rephrase that.
Please.
If the blood flow decreased rapidly, this would result in some stab wounds appearing less severe, right?
Or having less bleeding into the soft tissue surrounding them. Yes, again, as blood flow progresses, we're going to see less bleeding into the, I said blood flow, excuse me, blood volume decreases, we'll see less bleeding into the surrounding soft tissue. As to the length of time that takes, it's going to occur in the same order, but the time frame is going to be flexible depending on how quickly the bleeding is taking place. But again, jugular vein bleeding is vein bleeding, not artery bleeding. So it's going to bleed more slowly. And it's actually more amenable to pressure being applied to help stanch that bleeding. Arteries are a lot harder. And particularly if you're up in the axillary arteries, you can't put a tourniquet on that because the injury is actually above where the tourniquet would apply or could be applied. So that's going to be uncontrollable bleeding. The best you could do is press in that area and try to slow it down a little bit. But it's bleeding under pressure, so there's going to be a spurt with every heartbeat.
Now, this is where we really dig into the facts of this case to try to get to the truth of the events in the case and the truth of the timeline. But we already know that the time estimate for forensic pathologists, they generally interpret this kind of discrepancy as indicating a gap of at least several minutes, often 5 to 15, depending on the severity of blood loss from the first set of wounds. So the first key, as discussed by the pathologist in the actual hearing you just heard, is evidence surrounding arterial blood loss versus vein blood loss. The crime scene in this room does not show evidence of arterial spurts. And you can see in the room with Kaylee and Maddie, this is listed as cast off, not arterial spurts. We know the difference between cast off and arterial spurts. We see that clearly with Ethan. This is evidence of an arterial spurt. So when we take Zana into consideration here, Zana had 13 stab and incise wounds to the head and neck. 11 of those 13 were hemorrhagic. 2 of those showed minimal hemorrhage. Of the 5 stab and incise wounds to the torso, they all showed to be hemorrhagic. They were all bleeding. Of the 10 incise wounds to her upper extremities, even the superficial wounds on her hand, all showed hemorrhage. Every one of her wounds were hemorrhagic except for 2 that showed minimal hemorrhage, meaning 2 that were likely inflicted either after she had passed or right before she had passed. So of 28 total wounds on Maddie, 26 of the wounds, even the superficial defense wounds on her hand, showed hemorrhage. Only 2 wounds on her neck show minimal hemorrhage. This means there were several minutes between the initial wounds and the final wounds made on her neck. These were the final 2 wounds made on her neck, and I will give Turvey and company credit for bringing this to light, because these are the 2 cuts on Maddie's throat that were minimally hemorrhagic, which means these happened at least 3 minutes after the initial attack on Maddie. That's very important to note, because when we think about Maddie and the sequence of events, as I've interpreted them in this investigation, Maddie is in bed alone. The attacker enters the room and attacks Maddie from the left side. Maddie awakes and tries to fight off the attacker, and she gets 10 defensive wounds on her left arm and hand. Maddie's 10 defensive wounds are noted on her left arm and hand. 16 other hemorrhagic wounds are noted during this stage of the attack. He is interrupted by Kaylee during the attack after creating likely 26 wounds, 10 of them defensive, Maddie trying to fight him off. Kaylee is brought back into the room and placed in the bed with Maddie, and the attack on her continues. After the attack on Kaylee, either near death or post-mortem wounds are then made on Maddie's neck. The evidence from these wounds indicate a time interval of several minutes between the initial attack on Maddie and the final wounds made to her neck. Now, to verify that, we have to cross-reference Kaylee, because it's quite apparent that after Kaylee was brought back into the room and attacked, that the attacker then went to Maddie to create those post-mortem or near post-mortem wounds on her neck, and then returned to Kaylee and made 2 post-mortem wounds or near post-mortem wounds on Kaylee after making them on Maddie. And we can verify that based on the scenario and the wounds. Kaylee had 24 plus stab and incise wounds to the head and neck. Every single one of them were hemorrhagic. She had 11 stab and incise wounds to the torso. 9 of them were hemorrhagic. Only 2 were noted as minimally hemorrhagic. She had 3 stab and incise wounds to the upper extremities. All were noted to be hemorrhagic. So of 38 plus total wounds on Kaylee, 36 plus of them showed hemorrhage. Only 2 wounds on her chest show minimal hemorrhage. This means there were several minutes between the initial wounds and the final wounds made on her neck and chest. When we look at the final wounds that were made, they were 2 long incise wounds that matched the wounds made on Maddie, just in a different spot, measuring 5.5 inches and 3 3/4 inches. And there is moderate associated soft tissue hemorrhage, meaning these were the last wounds that happened on Kaylee, and time elapsed between these 2 wounds and the other wounds. It is likely that the offender left Kaylee, went to Maddie, created the 2 wounds on her neck, then returned to Kaylee to make these 2 wounds. What does this tell us? The sequence of events based on my investigation is once Kaylee is attacked in the bed, and once it is completed, the perp moved to Maddie, inflicting the matching slits on her neck to match the 2 that he put on Kaylee's. But then, once the injuries to Maddie were made, the perp then returned to Kaylee, inflicting the 2 chest wounds we just looked at. This indicates that a couple of minutes minimum between the completion of the attack on Kaylee and the final 2 wounds on Maddie, or the completion of the attack on Kaylee and the final 2 wounds that were made on Kaylee, there was at least a couple of minute time lapse. Minimal time frame of the entire attack on Maddie and Kaylee is 7 minutes from the start of the attack on Maddie until the final 2 wounds were carved into Kaylee. How do you get that, Pav? When we look at the timeline of known events in this case, I say this over and over. This is why I can't get on anybody else's radar as it relates to the timing of this crime, because the timing of this crime would indicate masterminds of trying to set this up in advance and make it play out like it did. And I don't think it's possible, especially considering the masterminds would be Dylan and Bethany. Give me a break. So at 4:19:07, this is the end of the attack. I'm going to start this at the end. Bethany calls Dylan and says she heard something, and it's a 23-second call. 4:19:20, a car door is heard shutting on the 1112 cam. Law enforcement recreated it so that they could verify that that was a car door shutting where they thought it was. That was a perp getting into the white car, at least one, if not 2. At 4:19 and 30 seconds, between 4:19 and 30 seconds and 4:20 and 28 seconds, DM sees the last perp leaving. First perp is already gone because we hear the car door shut. First 1 or 2 perps, maybe 3, who knows? But the last perp she doesn't see until between 4:19:30 and 4:20 and 28 seconds. We know that because at 4:20 and 28 seconds, Dylan calls Bethany and says she saw a man in the mask. And then 20 seconds later, the vehicle comes speeding out of the neighborhood, indicating the people that were already in the car at 4:19 and 20 seconds were getting ready to leave. And the perp that Dylan saw leaving was not in the car with the other perps. That's why I believe the perp leaving at 4:23 in the sport utility that was parked on Linda Lane is the other perp. But the attack is over, as BF likely has heard a perp leaving from the front door at 4:19. All the evidence of the blood on the stairwell being Ethan's, blocked by the White Claw box, and the blood on the handrail, unknown male B and unknown A they didn't test, is obviously from a perp or 2 perps leaving via the staircase to the first floor and out the front door. I believe that is the noise that Bethany actually heard. So if the attack is over at 4:19, the attack is over, as BF likely has heard a perp leaving from the front door at 4:19. 7 minutes prior to the attack on Maddie, 7 minutes prior, the attack on Maddie starts. Likely time frame of the initial attack on Maddie is 4:12 a.m. Now, can we verify that in other ways? Here's the sequence of events that I've put together based on the evidence in this case. Number 1, at 4:12 a.m., Maddie is in the bed alone. The attacker enters the room and attacks Maddie from the left side. Maddie awakes, and 10 defensive wounds are noted on her left arm and hand. 16 other hemorrhagic wounds are noted during this stage of the attack, all happening relative of the time frame of the attack because of the hemorrhage in the wounds. The attacker is interrupted by Kaylee. At 4:16 a.m., Kaylee's brought into the room and placed in the bed with Maddie, and the attack on her continues. After the attack on Kaylee, either near death or post-mortem wounds are then made on Maddie's neck. The evidence from these wounds indicate a time interval of several minutes between initial attack on Maddie and the final wounds made to her neck. This indicates at 4:19 that a couple of minutes minimum between the completion of the attack on Kaylee and the final 2 wounds that were made on Kaylee's upper shoulder had to have had time between the attack on Kaylee and those 2 wounds for them to be minimally hemorrhagic. Time frame of events: start at 4:12, end at 4:19. Minimal the time frame of the attack on Maddie and Kaylee is 7 minutes from the start of the attack on Maddie until the final 2 wounds were made on Kaylee. You can go through this and triple verify it 500 times, and you're going to find that when you add in 3 minutes in between the initial attack and that are all hemorrhagic, and the wounds on the minimum 3-minute window of being minimally hemorrhagic, it's going to double verify this timeline. This means the attack on Ethan and Zana would start at 4:16 a.m., the same time the attack on Kaylee is getting underway. Here is why the state's timeline is correct, but the number of perps needed to accomplish this is 3 minimum, but the evidence shows 4. When we look at this particular wound on Ethan, this is a fatal wound that cut his internal jugular, subclavian veins, and left subclavian artery. This is what we see, why we see the arterial spurt in the room with Ethan where he was positioned. As we heard the pathologist say, the arterial spurt, it's going to shoot out like we see on the wall. That is a fatal wound. That is the worst wound that Ethan actually received. But it tells us so much, and here's why. Because after researching, how long would Ethan have once that injury was inflicted to be able to likely move and fight back is one of the keys to this case, along with the wounds he received that were minimally hemorrhagic. Rapid blood loss. Most people with a fully severed or badly torn subclavian artery will bleed out in 2 to 5 minutes. In many cases, especially if the artery is completely transected, death can occur in under 3 minutes. So under 3 minutes it can occur, bleeds out usually between 2 and 5 minutes. Let's just say that this is a under 3 minute case, so 2 minutes minimum. But what does that tell us about the strength and the capability of Ethan once this strike was made? Strength and capability, 0 to 30 seconds. Initial heavy bleeding and dizziness, can still fight or run briefly. So after that strike is made, there is 30 seconds where Ethan can fight. Ethan can get up and he can run. He has strength. So after that injury was inflicted, the perp didn't just get off of Ethan and Ethan lay there, because Ethan could have got up and moved, and we know he didn't move from his spot. That means that that perp had to stay on top of Ethan, holding him down during this event. 30 to 90 seconds, rapid drop in blood pressure and weakness, severe loss of strength and collapsing. So that means for almost a minute and a half, though, Ethan had to be held down by that perp. After 2 to 4 minutes, little to no purposeful movement, 4+ minutes, cardiac arrest, no strength. Well, we can estimate that it took 3 minutes between the start of that and to the end, giving the minimal timeline of how long it took for the perp to dispel Ethan. But it's clear indication that Ethan would have had enough strength for at least a minute to be able to get up and fight off the attacker, which indicates the attacker that attacked Ethan had to stay on top of Ethan, holding him down until the end of the attack. And there's more evidence to back that up. We know now, based on the timeline, likely at 4:16 a.m., Zana opens the door and she is attacked. That's position number 1. As she is attacked, she goes back and to the right because the blood evidence in position number 2 tells us Zana was still on her feet by the blood that was spattered across the wall that came from an area that Zana would still have to be on her feet to create. So position number 2, when Zana goes back to this position in the room, she's still on her feet being attacked. This is the point where the other perp has run in and jumped on top of Ethan and began to attack Ethan, including making the fatal wound Ethan had to his subclavian artery. Now, it cannot be one perp, because if one perp goes back and attacks Zana in position number 2 here, then leaves Zana and jumps on Ethan and creates that wound, he would have to then go back to Zana, but Ethan's got a minute of fight left in him and Ethan never left this spot. It did not happen that way. This perp stayed on top of Ethan while this perp was fighting Zana to the next positions in the room. Once the fatal blow is inflicted on Ethan, the perp would still have to hold him down for 90 seconds, or Ethan would have had more than enough strength to move and maybe even fight off Zana's attacker. Now, to double verify that, Ethan as well has stab wounds or incise wounds. He actually had 2 stab wounds that were minimally hemorrhagic. So of Ethan's total 17 wounds, 15 of the wounds, even the superficial defensive wounds on his hand, showed hemorrhage. Only 2 wounds on his legs show minimal hemorrhage. This means there were several minutes between the initial wounds and the final wounds made on his legs. Of the stab wounds to the head and neck, 4 were hemorrhagic. Of the 1 stab wound to his torso that was the major blow that caused his death, it was hemorrhagic. 6 incise wounds to his upper extremities, his defensive wounds, were all hemorrhagic. Of the 6 stab and incise wounds to his lower extremities, 4 were hemorrhagic. And then there were 2 at the end that showed minimal hemorrhage. Once again, this wound here, minimally hemorrhagic wound track, happened at the end, after the fact. This wound here, minimally hemorrhagic wound track, happened at the end, after the fact. Now, we go back to what we talked about originally. The difference between the time in hemorrhagic wounds and minimally hemorrhagic wounds, pathologists interpret this as a minimum of at least several minutes, often 5 to 15, depending on the severity of blood loss. Well, we know that Ethan's blood loss would absolutely take roughly 3 minutes. We've just verified that. So 3 minutes on the blood loss of Ethan in conjunction with 3 minutes between hemorrhagic and non-hemorrhagic wounds double verifies the timeline of the attack on Ethan from 4/16 to 4/19. Then there's Zana. And once again, it verifies the timeline. 67 stab and incise wounds on Zana. Of those, 62 were hemorrhagic. Only 5 were minimally hemorrhagic. But the 5 minimally hemorrhagic wounds, again, verifies the timeline. The timeline between hemorrhagic and non-hemorrhagic wounds is a minimum of 3 minutes. Again, backing up a minimum of 3 minutes from the start of the attack on Zana until the end. The wounds literally tell the story. These are the necessary clues to what actually happened in this case. This proves that the attack on Ethan and Zana was happening simultaneously to the attack on Kaylee. With 2 perps necessary to accomplish the attack on Ethan and Zana, this proves at minimum 3 attackers necessary. However, the knife evidence, I believe, is going to prove 4, as well as other evidence around this scenario. And that's coming to you soon. Let me know your thoughts.